So you all are interested in policies that make a difference. And this is Christine Sommer from the Marion County Housing Authority as your moderator.
Hello. Woo. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Sommer. I'm with the Marion County Housing Authority. Welcome this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us and for the panel, Shaping the Future's Policies That Make a Difference. The purpose of this panel this afternoon is to have an open discussion surrounding the current and the future policies around affordable housing and how to decrease friction between all entities involved, from development to implementation and the longevity of developments. Sorry, a little nervous. So again, I'm Christine. I'm the Housing Choice Voucher Program Manager over at Marion County Housing Authority. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily. Emily, tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure, thanks Christine. I'm Emily Ryman. I'm the CEO of Dev Northwest. We are a nonprofit community development corporation, and one of our main roles in the community is to develop affordable housing, both rental and ownership. And then we also do a host of other activities around neighborhood revitalization, asset building for low-income families, community development lending. So we do consumer and micro and small business lending for folks who might not otherwise be able to do it, and a bunch of activities around helping basically low and moderate income communities build financial stability and build assets and economic opportunity, of which of course housing is a central pillar. So that's what brings me to the panel today.
And Tracy?
Hi, I'm Tracy Manning. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Development Center. There's paper on your table about us. But the Housing Development Center is a nonprofit. We work throughout the state of Oregon, a little bit in Washington, and we assist other nonprofits and small housing authorities and mid-sized and large housing authorities to develop and operate affordable housing. So we provide development consulting services, construction management, finance management, also asset management training, third-party asset management. You'll see there's a work group that if your asset and property managers aren't on, they should be. It's in the paper on your table. And we have a small CDFI that does primarily pre-development lending. So thank you.
All right, and Sam.
Hi, I'm Samuel Goldberg. I work at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We're a statewide civil rights nonprofit. We cover the whole state, and we have staff in many different regions all over the state, and working on both education and outreach about fair housing law and then enforcement of fair housing law. So I'm on the education and outreach side, as is my colleague Mel Keller at the table over there. So we like to come out and do these kinds of upstream solutions for fair housing, make sure that people know about fair housing responsibilities from the beginning, so to give our enforcement team a break and make sure that they have less to do on the back end.
Excellent, thank you so much. I'm gonna lead off with a question I'd like for all of you to answer. Let's start with Emily. What are some specific examples of policy changes that will create more housing and especially affordable housing in our community?
Absolutely. This is a question we could probably talk for the next 4 hours on. But I think Tracy and I are going to tag team a little bit on policies specifically aimed at getting more units on the ground. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the non-money pieces, and then Tracy's going to focus a bit more on the money pieces. I think the first thing I would start out by saying is that there are a ton of policies at pretty much every level of government, right down to neighborhood associations, that can help smooth the way for housing development and affordable housing development. So even when money is tight, and even when Salem and DC are fighting over the dollars, there are also non-monetary things we can do, non-dollar things we can do that are super important for the development of housing. Some of those are rooted in land use. So there have been efforts recently at the state level and at local jurisdiction levels to try to enable more types of housing to be built in more places and at different levels of density than we have been able to build smoothly in the past. So for decades, our land use laws were designed to build single-family housing on quarter-acre lots or fairly large-scale multifamily housing. And so our zoning codes were built to make single-family lots easy to create and larger-scale apartment complexes easy to create. And if you wanted to do something different from that, it was an uphill battle. I actually went to a museum recently that was featuring missing middle housing and unique housing types. And there was a quote there from one of the developers that said, "Every development I've ever begun was illegal the day that I began it." And he had to fight to get those land use laws changed to be able to enable the type of development that he wanted to do. And that stuck with me because that's really the case. We're making some progress. ADUs used to be an uphill battle, and they are much easier to develop now. 2001, a couple of years ago, enabled up to a quadplex and cottage clusters in places that had traditionally been single-family zoning. That was a huge change for our state. There's additional work to be done. I think we still, single room occupancy is still hard to develop in a lot of places. I think that could be, the path for that could be smoothed. I think multi-generational housing is still sometimes an uphill battle, and that could be smoothed out. I think there are still parking restrictions and other things like that that sometimes force developers to trade parking spaces for units. And that is a hard one to justify when we're in the midst of, you heard this morning, 140,000 units short. So I think, I think the important thing is really to encourage, every jurisdiction from the city to the county to the state to be really analyzing those land use codes and where we can remove barriers, where we can ease that path. And I think also, especially at the jurisdictional level, I would highlight, you've heard a lot of comments about process and delays and how much that impacts a project, both from a timing perspective and from a cost perspective. And I think just operationally, how we build processes at the local level to try to expedite and to try to get to yes. There are some jurisdictions that are still approaching development as though we, the developer, have to come in and prove how we meet every checkbox and how we conform to every requirement. And there are other jurisdictions, I think some of them here locally, that are setting a really good example, and I would just encourage continuing to push on how do we get to yes? How do we bring everybody to the table to make quick decisions, to not throw up barriers where we don't need to not ask for the 18-page response if we know that this development is sound and that it has a pathway forward, and just really figure out how we can streamline and how we can make that stuff easier. So, a lot of land use decisions is, I think, where there's ability to make movement. There are also, and more of these live at the state level than at the local level, but building codes that I think we need to examine to make development easier also. There have been some recent examples about this, trying to enable tiny house development. Tiny house developers were running into challenges with the building code about not having staircases that met code, or not having adequate egress windows from the little mini balconies that are sleeping lofts inside of tiny homes. And so the building code really had to catch up to the type of development that we're interested in doing to try to address the housing crisis. And I think, again, there's more work that we can be doing there. Dev Northwest ran into some issues recently doing cottage clusters, as an example. And right now, according to the building code, we had a 12 cottage cluster of, the largest house was 1,200 square feet, the smallest one was 500 square feet. We had to run individual sewer lines from every house out to the street. We weren't allowed to try to connect them mid-property and do master lines out to the street. And that adds tens of thousands of dollars to a project. So small changes of, okay, if missing middle housing is what we're trying to create, then we need the land use regulations to catch up to that, and we need the building codes to catch up to that, to make this efficient and to try to save us the money we need to make those units affordable in the end. So I think really analyzing, to the extent we can do some state level advocacy, analyzing those building codes and figuring out where we can make changes. And then the third one I would highlight is a little bit tangential, except not really, and that is an issue that you heard referenced already today a couple of times around prevailing wages and how those are being applied to affordable housing projects. And So there are two issues that are at play here that are creating barriers to affordable housing. One is that if we are developing housing above commercial, so you see this oftentimes in downtown cores, where you might have a 4 or 5 story building, the ground floor is commercial and affordable housing is above. With that split use, BOLI applies commercial prevailing wage to the entire project, which can add millions of dollars to the cost of the affordable housing in that project. And it means one of two things. It means either the project doesn't get built, or we can't put the commercial on the ground floor. You turn the ground floor into more housing, or you turn the ground floor into a community room that only the residents can use. It can't even be a community room that is open to the community. It has to be only for resident use, or that the commercial prevailing wage gets triggered. And so that's a real barrier. And the second one is actually with the conversion of commercial buildings to affordable housing. So Dev Northwest ran into this with a church we're trying to convert here in Salem to veterans housing, and the Housing Authority ran into it with Yaquina Hall as well. And theirs is even more ironic because it originally was housing. It had only been temporarily used as offices, but BOLI said, hey, because the most recent use was commercial, we're going to deny your exemption for affordable housing, which you would get if you were building on bare land, you would get if you were rehabbing an affordable housing property, but you're not going to get if you're converting commercial. And so, for Dev Northwest, what that's going to mean is that we're not going to look at commercial conversions until we can get that policy changed at the state level, because we just can't make it pencil. And so all of a sudden, we're in the space of advocating around wages and trying to negotiate with unions around getting to a kind of a grand bargain that will allow affordable housing to go forward. Of course we believe in living wage jobs. Of course we want the trades to make good wages. They are who we rely on to get these projects built. And yet, if the state intends to exempt affordable housing, they need to exempt all affordable housing. And we need to understand the role that has in the midst of our housing crisis. So wide breadth of opportunity for advocacy in ways big and small that shape the landscape on affordable housing and that shape our ability to get units on the ground.
Tracy?
Yeah. So my comments are pretty focused on local jurisdictions and what we can do to, my favorite call words, reduce friction and demonstrate support are the two things that I think are the lowest hanging fruit that can really make a difference in getting a local project selected for funding. The process for funding affordable housing federally in all of the states and privately with investors and banks is ridiculous. So the key is to figure out where you can have impact. So just to keep this sort of introductory part short, I'm going to start with 3 things. So most of the money that's going to go into any local project is going to come through the state, whether this money originated at the state or the money originated federally and is being distributed by the state. So 3 things that local jurisdictions can do to align with the state and increase the chances of a project getting funded less expensively, and getting funded quickly. So one is being timely. Aligning whatever award process that is happening locally with the state's process. The state likes to be last in, and most to all funding sources the state puts out, you have 1 shot at it a year. Some you only have 1 shot at every 2 years. So really deeply important to get the timing right. Project priorities. Every community that I've ever seen a housing needs assessment or community development assessment has multiple priorities that have been identified by the community members. If you look at the places where your community's needs align with the things that the state is really focused on funding, meaning it's going to get sort of higher priority, higher points in a process, that alignment is going to increase the chances of your project getting funded. And then, Emily touched a little bit on application and process requirements. Did I mention this was ridiculous? It's ridiculous what kind of paper churning has to happen for a unit to get built. No, I sit at a desk most of my day. Nobody believes that produces affordable housing, but it does. So application and process requirements. What do you need to have? What's nice to have? Can you use the regulatory processes that the state already has in place, just to kind of give your project, your developers in your community that extra time to do something else for their community. And then really when it comes, so that's sort of more in the category of reducing friction, when it comes to demonstrating support, an award certainly of money, but also of land or waived fees or charges, hugely helpful in clearly demonstrating this community wants this housing. And also, we quickly rezoned the land, or there was a conditional use hearing and it went through pretty quickly, just demonstrating that this is actually something that we want, and we're not going to get pissed off if you fund it. And in some application rounds, money from local money increases the points that the project is going to get, so increases the likelihood that it's going to get funded. And then finally, land. Free land, it can be great, but the location and condition of the land can also increase the likelihood of funding. There are a lot of points in the state process for the location of the land, for all the things that you would think of, right? Being near good parks and schools and transit. Obviously if the land is dirty and doesn't have infrastructure to it, that's really going to put a hindrance in your ability to get something funded. And then the location of the land can actually increase the amount of funds that the project is eligible to attract federally. There's these qualified census tracts and difficult to develop areas, but it gets you a 30% boost in the amount of funding that the project can attract, which is huge. So just, sort of know you want the housing, taking the granted extra time to align with these processes can get a project funded faster, more easily, more likely to get funded, can save you a year or more in the funding process and actually attract more money to the project. So that's a start.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And Sam, would you like to add anything?
I mean, at this point, everything I've heard sounds about in line. I think, when it comes to, sometimes fair housing can be the fly in the ointment, I think, in terms of the development of affordable housing for far too long. I think it's been kind of two different camps who have overlapping goals, but pursuing either to the maximum can end up, hurting the other goal. So generally in the development of affordable housing, the top goal is how many units can you build for how cheaply, for a set amount of money. And if you are pursuing that to the maximum, then you could end up with decisions about the location of where you're building, or decisions like that end up doubling down on existing patterns of segregation and discrimination. And so that's another factor that has to be thoughtfully considered as you're going through all of this. So I appreciate all the policies that I'm hearing already, because I think that a lot of them can align with that fair housing goal, integrative goal as well.
Excellent, thank you. Tracy, could you tell us a little bit more about CET, SDC waivers, local bonds, need for local match investments, need to align application cycles for state, et cetera?
Sure. So that each of those are, CET, construction excise taxes, is one source of funding that a lot of local jurisdictions use to generate the resources to provide that local funding match. SDC waiver, Systems Development Charge waiver. Some communities have them by right for affordable housing, which can really help with planning. Others are more of an application process. I mean, they're all application processes. But they can also demonstrate support, both demonstrate support for a local project, reduce the cost of funding that project, and as I was discussing earlier, really reduce the timeline for funding. And having that local support that is first in or early in dollars is sort of like a vote that says, I as a local funder, a local jurisdiction, am telling you, state funder, federal funder, bank, investor, that this project represents something my community needs, my community asks for. And so I'm investing in this project early because I believe in it and my community needs it and my community is going to support it.
If I could add
Oh,
one
yeah,
thing,
please.
too. So a couple of points here that I want to loop back to earlier conversations today. During the presentation about 4% and 9% bonds, there was some reference to the fact that those are becoming increasingly competitive, and that in fact, the Portland metro area, because they have passed so many local funding sources between bonds and CET and some of those other local sources, is now sort of sucking in more than their fair share of some of these state and federal dollars. Because the application, the state and federal evaluation is prioritized to meet the local investment dollars. And I just want to name that in the room because I think this is an important trend for folks outside of the Portland metro area to be paying attention to. If we in the Mid-Valley want to have sort of fair shot at those 9% dollars, at those 4% dollars, we have to have those local investment dollars so that developers in this area can compete with the folks from the metro area who are coming in with those metro bond dollars or those Portland bond dollars. And so I think really sort of pushing the jurisdictions in this area to think about all of the resources that might be available. CET is one of them, but local bonds are also a possibility. And I think really if we can take an all things on the table approach, every bit of that local investment becomes really critical to the future competitiveness for the state dollars and the federal dollars.
Excellent. Thank you for that follow-up. Samuel, will you please tell us a little bit about affirmatively furthering fair housing and what it means for areas interested in increasing housing stocks?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about the original definition of it. It dates back to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It's been a provision in the law since the beginning, but has been kind of nebulous in terms of what it actually means. But very basically, it is that if you are receiving any funds from housing and urban development, then you have an additional obligation to not perpetuate new segregation or discrimination, but also to roll back existing patterns of segregation. So generally what that has looked like since 1968 has been just kind of analyzing the problem. Jurisdictions that get their own community development block grant funds have to do an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice every 4 years or so. And analyze disparities in their community and make some broad plans on how they're going to deal with it. But that largely has not had a lot of teeth, at least at the federal level. There's certainly hope that the current rulemaking that's happening around AFFH is going to be a little stronger in terms of what HUD is asking for. But the really big development recently in the state of Oregon is that we actually have as of the passage of House Bill 2001, we have a definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing in state law. It's in the OARs now. So any city that is above 10,000 are going to have to take into consideration that those existing patterns of segregation and what to do about it in their planning processes. So things like the housing production strategies that you may have heard of, things like the housing needs analysis. The AFFH is actually going to be a part of that process. So I mentioned that fair housing can be a fly in the ointment as far as affordable housing goes. I also like to think of it from the opposite direction, and I think that Tracy and Emily really set it up well. The idea of making the case, jurisdictions making the case for why a particular project is necessary, if they're armed with this data of the historical harms that have been made to communities of color and other protected classes, and can make the case that a particular affordable housing development placed right, studied right, is going to serve the needs of that community and can actually undo those patterns of discrimination and segregation, well, then that project is going to be a lot more attractive. So once again, it kind of depends on how it's framed and how you're using the information and the data. It could be a hindrance to the development of units, but I like to think that it could also be a tool for the creation of new units and for solving a lot of other social issues as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Let's start with Emily. To what extent can nonprofits play a role in advocacy?
Oh, I love answering this question. The answer to this is a lot, and I think in the nonprofit sector, for a lot of years, there was this hesitation to delve into advocacy and this sort of general understanding that you might put your IRS status at risk, or you might put your nonprofit status at risk, or that was frowned upon. And really, the rules are a lot more flexible and a lot more lenient than a lot of folks know, I think, in our industry. So a couple things to keep in mind here. One is that, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but essentially, there's a pretty clear path forward from the IRS perspective if advocacy is a relatively minimal part of what you're doing. So this is sort of in proportion with the overall budget of your organization and the overall capacity of your organization. So for an organization like Dev Northwest, we have 65 staff members. We have an annual operating budget of $8 million-ish, and bigger than that even with our capital project budgets. We can invest multiple staff members working full-time in advocacy and not run up against any concerns from an IRS perspective. And paired with that the definition of lobbying that the IRS is worried about is specifically influencing the voters. So if you are doing a direct mailing or a direct email out to voters to say, please vote yes on this bond campaign, that is considered lobbying. Or if you are sitting directly in front of a public official or a committee saying, please vote this way on this bill, that is considered lobbying. But there is a whole lot of work that can happen that is outside of that definition. So if we as nonprofit housing experts or social service experts get called to testify in front of a committee as an expert to talk about the need for housing, or how affordable housing can change the trajectory of a given population, or how housing is related to healthcare and healthcare outcomes, all of that that's informational, it's educational, it's not considered lobbying. And yet it is hugely important in changing the narrative and in bolstering support for then the future policy asks that we're going to have to try to increase development, or try to change land use codes, or implement a new funding source, or whatever the issue may be. And so I really, I always try to sort of stand on that soapbox for a moment of folks in the nonprofit sector. We are here to create a more just community. We are here to change the needle on inequality and injustice. And I really don't think we can do that unless we're willing to tackle the policy changes and tackle the advocacy issues. I think Mayor Hoy this morning talked about how where we are today is the result of specific policy choices, and the progress that we're making is the result of specific policy choices. It is so true. And I really would encourage everybody who is in the social service sector, in the nonprofit sector, to figure out the ways that you can lean into advocacy. And I guess on a side note to that, I also, I believe the same thing for all of us as individuals in a community. showing up at neighborhood meetings and being the counter voice to the NIMBYs, right? There is a growing YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard, which is literally like, take the 2 hours on a Monday night to show up at the neighborhood meeting when they're considering an affordable housing project in that neighborhood to say, I want people to be able to live in this neighborhood. I want this neighborhood to be welcoming and inclusive of people at all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum. And be that voice that says, yes, here, I support this project here. And starting that small, starting that local, and all the way on up, we all of us have a role that we can play to share our voice in favor of housing development in our community. And I think that's really important.
Say yes to housing. I love it. Tracy?
I think that question was aimed at Emily, but yeah, I have nothing to add.
And Sam, do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm kind of subject to a lot of the same rules in terms of direct advocacy or things of that nature, but I do a lot of informing people of their obligations under federal and state law. I also do a lot of training for advocates about kind of the legal framework and the historical framework of housing in their communities. So kind of arming them with the tools to go to battle at City Hall and get things through. I have a training called Building Inclusive Communities that I actually originally developed for nonprofit developers, but I've since adapted it to a lot of community groups and YIMBY groups and people who are engaging with these the systems, land use systems, or zoning or housing, the housing world for the first time, because it can be a very opaque and intimidating place. And so, yeah, really empowering people, giving them the information they need, letting them know where the leverage points are all activities that I engage in without directly advocating on specific items.
Hearing you speak, Emily, it made me think of a saying I heard a long time ago. It's housing is a basic human right. And, there's you can be a small advocate, you can be a big advocate, but you can advocate for it. And so it's a good thing. Any questions? Anybody out there have questions? Mayor Hoy. It's right there behind you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for your partnership with the city. We really appreciate. We're so glad that you're here. You mentioned in your kind of opening remarks about barriers to multi-generational housing, and I was hoping you could expand on that. What are those barriers that you're referring to, and what can we do to eliminate them?
Excellent question, and I am not an expert in this, but I can share some kind of preliminary thoughts. I would actually start by, before I go into the direct policy ideas, one of the other thoughts that's been rattling around my brain today as we're talking about like pre-development and first dollars in, and how local jurisdictions can really sort of seed fund development. One of the things that's challenging from a developer's perspective is the money for community organizing on the front end of a project to really let the community influence that future project. This has come up a lot in multi-generational housing, particularly for communities that have been historically underserved. So Latino community, Native communities, folks that historically have lived more intergenerationally than the sort of nuclear, white picket fence family. And I wish that there was more funding for that. I wish that there was more investment in that sort of community organizing time, because I would want this question really influenced by the communities who are going to be the users of that housing. And I think some of the changes that we've made have been important here. I think ADUs are important for multi-generational housing. I think that being able to do duplexes and triplexes are important for multi-generational housing. But those are still pretty defined pathways, right? It's like you couldn't, at this point, in almost all the jurisdictions, at least that we work in, build a single family home that had 2 kitchens and some separate living spaces, but like, is it a duplex, is it not a duplex? How do you define that? And then what codes apply if you're trying to build that home? And that gets sticky. Same with like the old version of like rooming houses, where you had, you know, a home that had a shared kitchen and shared living space, but maybe it's got some mini apartments or mini sort of bed-sit arrangements in the old-fashioned language that different generations of a house or of a family could use. There are still not clear pathways for that type of development. So I think we still have some work to do in terms of really thinking through what's the full continuum of the style of housing that different families need, and different combinations of families need, and then make sure that our zoning codes are lined up with that. And then the building codes too, like that's an even separate battle. But yes, I'm hopeful about the general direction, and I think if we can continue that momentum, it would be fantastic.
Got a question right over there behind you.
You can hold it too. So a couple of financial tools and policy incentives have been described for smaller communities that don't have large pots of money to provide or to create the incentive. If you had to choose one that a community should automatically support, whether it be property tax abatement, CET, SDC waivers, what's the biggest bang for its buck tool that you would recommend a smaller community to try to implement to provide that support for affordable housing?
Well, we could pick two different ones, and that way we wouldn't. I like just off the top of my head, the cost to operate housing is going through the roof, just like the rest of the cost of living in different communities. You know, utility costs, insurance just went nuts. And so I think, and then if you want to serve large families or, you know, small communities, you know, would naturally have smaller multifamily buildings or single family, and so you don't really get those economies of scale. So I'm going to pick property tax exemptions because over time you're going to you know, so first of all, you're going to decrease the operating, the cost to operate each one of those units. Maybe there's a little bit more revenue, so you're actually also going to let them get a bigger mortgage. So that's also going to help build the thing, and it's going to make it operate better over the long term. Pro tip, if you can get the property tax exemption by right in code, for 15 years from the first year it's granted, that makes all the other funding sources work really well in super technical, annoying ways that will hold up a project.
I would agree with that, and I'm going to add a couple of cheat additions. For home ownership development, so there is increasing funding at the state level for affordable home ownership development for families below 80% AMI that have to have long-term affordability. So they're most commonly like a community land trust model, although there are a few other legal structures that can accommodate that. In those cases, we typically get a special assessment on the property taxes that does have some property taxes paid, but also recognizes that that family is not going to get the full appreciated value over time, and so those taxes should be limited. So in that case, I would probably argue for SDCs over the property tax exemption for affordable ownership development, which is a little bit of a tweak. And then the other one that I would encourage is land donation. And I know not all small jurisdictions have it, but some do. We worked with Florence a couple years back on a CLT development because they had moved their senior center, and the land where the senior center used to be located was vacant. And so they were able to donate that to create the CLT project. And that's really powerful because control of land is something that you need to be able to move forward with the funding applications, and control of land in the last 10 years has been really difficult. We are often outbid by market rate cash kind of buyers. Very few buyers are interested in a 18-month closing period while we figure out if we can put the funding model together. And so I think that land donation at the front end can be really critical. with all the caveats that Tracy mentioned earlier about it has to be able to pass environmental reviews, and it's best if it's not directly next to a railroad track, and all of those various parts and pieces.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And everybody get out a pen and a piece of paper. This is the most important question because I'd like for you all to take away from this next question at least one thing that you're going to do for the community. It's what is the best ways for people in this room to play a role in getting the policy changes we need. So take out a pen, take out a piece of paper, and write down one way that you guys are going to help support affordable housing in our community over the next 12 months after they answer this question. Yeah, big one.
Sam needs to start off.
I think Sam needs
I
to
need
start
to
this
start
one,
on this
yeah.
one?
Go for it, Sam.
Well, I see you have my slides pulled up. I guess I should have
Yes,
put those
here,
up
let's go.
earlier.
They're not showing. There they are.
Yeah, here we go.
All
Okay,
right,
so
go for it, Sam.
So I would say arm yourself with knowledge, right? So I talked about the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. This is Salem Kaiser's from 2019. Kaiser has now become part of the entitlement jurisdiction of Marion County, so this isn't a 100% current map, but it still is pretty illustrative of what I'm going to talk about. So, so in the analysis of impediments, there's a lot of research that gets done, looking at census data, looking at geological data, geographical data, economic data. So here's a series of maps that I want to show you. So the left is labor market engagement index. So that is a complex combination of factors of employability of the different populations. So the darker colors, blue and green means higher on that scale. Yellow means lower on that scale. And then on the right is environmental health. So Salem does actually a really good job of tracking exposure to pollution. And so the darker colors in this map would mean that you're less exposed to pollution. Lighter colors means you're more likely to be exposed to pollution. Can we see the next two? Oh, was there another one? Was there one before this? Oh, yeah, sorry, the first one. One more before that. Okay, so here's two more. So here's the low poverty index is on the left. So that's your likelihood to be exposed to poverty is going to be much lower in the darker sections and much higher in the lighter sections. And then the school proficiency index, which is obviously very determinative about where people decide that they want to live. Darker color means higher performing schools. And lighter colored means lower performing schools. So very clearly there's a pattern across all of these maps, right? If you looked at all these maps, you would have a pretty good idea of where you are going to have the highest quality of life. And the question, and these kinds of disparities can exist for all kinds of reasons. And so some are actual policy choices, some are totally organic. The thing that we're concerned about is, do these disparities fall along the lines of a protected class? And so now we can go to that last slide. So this is the percentage of census tracts where there are the most Hispanic or Latino people living in Salem. So as you can see, the areas that have the highest also were those lighter colors in the earlier maps, and the areas that are the whitest are the areas that were the darker colors on those earlier maps. So clearly, for a variety of reasons, some intentional, some not so intentional, these disparities exist. And so I would say all of this kind of documentation, this kind of information, it is available. You can. It's not always in a, depending on the community you're in, it might not be put together in an analysis of impediments like Salem has. But all of this is publicly available information, and so you can look into this and advocate for public investment in the areas that actually need it, right? We talk about how limited our dollars are, how limited our resources are. If that's true, then we really need to think about targeting those investments to where they're most needed, and also targeting them in a way that they don't double down on the patterns of poverty and segregation that already exist. Arm yourself with knowledge. Yeah.
Yes.
And you'll get more points in the state application cycle if you stay in the dark-colored areas. So I'm going to split the question. I would say if you work for a nonprofit or other sort of client-facing organization, either has developed housing or serves people who need affordable housing, collect some specific stories about how specifically affordable housing makes an impact and how a policy specifically could make a change, a difference for the families and the people of your community, and share that with a policymaker. Because, you know, frankly, the kind of information that I put together all day is really terrible. It's spreadsheets and technical words, and it's not very persuasive. But for the folks on the ground who see, like, you know, this $10,000 change in, you know, this family saved $300 a month on rent moving into affordable housing, and, you know, their kid went to summer camp, or, you know, they were able to get their car fixed. I mean, that's so valuable, and it's something that uniquely your communities can share. And I would say if you're on the sort of policy and government and funder end of things, see what's possible, you know, so what's the low-hanging fruit? Is it the property tax exemption, or, you know, is there a little land inventory somewhere? And connect with someone like Emily in your community to say, how can we do this well to make a difference in your ability to create this housing? Just make those really specific people and community-oriented connections.
I echo all of that. And I think, I mean, I already spoke to the sort of the individual level. Like, I really can't stress enough the showing up at the neighborhood meeting. I know it seems small, and it's probably not what anybody wants to do on the Monday night when you have 47 other things you could be doing. But voices at that level really matter. And I would say ditto for coming to city council meetings, coming to planning commission meetings, when there are affordable housing projects that are trying to go through a subdivision process or trying to go through whatever the public process might be, trying to go through a funding application, and just show up to say yes. I think that's really critical. I think also from a nonprofit perspective, there are a lot of ways you can join collaborative advocacy efforts. So joining a group like the Oregon Housing Alliance, and lending your voice to those collective efforts, I think can be a lot of influence for relatively less effort if you're not ready to sort of hire a lobbyist of your own, kind of a situation. For the public jurisdictions, I want to just, this might not be the easiest thing or the first thing, but another kind of policy idea that's rattling out there in the world, especially right now in the economy when construction lending is like 10% and 11%. It's killing projects. And there are interesting models being explored by jurisdictions around how to actually get approval to invest jurisdictional reserves into affordable housing development projects. So if you have, you know, city reserves or county reserves that are right now invested in bonds or something like that, how can you actually utilize some of those reserves to invest in CDFIs that fund affordable housing projects, or something like that? And I think that just hasn't been mentioned yet today. So I don't know that it's the lowest hanging fruit, but it's one that I think is worth exploring to get to some of the dollars where, you know, a jurisdiction might not be able to grant, and that's understandable, but are there other creative financing resources that we can think about using on behalf of affordable housing?
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Do we have any other questions out there? Hang tight, the microphone's on its way.
Thank you. I'd like you to consider my question from an equity perspective. It's been recommended by this panel that cities and other entities perhaps forgive property taxes. Earlier, it was suggested that system development charges be forgiven. Property taxes, of course, are used for cities to maintain and operate their facilities. System development charges don't go away if you build an affordable housing unit. So how can you justify shifting the tax burden to other members of the community without their approval in order to facilitate the kind of development you're discussing?
I mean, I think that's what government does, is shift our collective resources in a way that, as a community, for the things that we prioritize, whether it's the police or schools. I mean, I don't have kids. What do I care? And so, but I think what the point you make is really important, that it is, it can sound like it's a mask. It's escaping me what the sort of governing word is. It's still an expenditure, right? I think is the point that you're raising, is if you're not it's a kind of expenditure because you're, the things that those property taxes and systems development charges are supporting will still need to happen. And it's a reasonable thing to say that should be a conscious choice. That doesn't need to be hidden. And we make revenue choices all the time. And yes, we are advocating that some of those revenue choices would go to support housing that the market will not build.
A couple thoughts I would add to that too. So in this country, we actually spend, our largest housing subsidy goes to upper income homeowners. And that is in the form of the mortgage interest deduction. Nationally, I forget the stats, but I think nationally it's something like 10 or 12 times more of an expenditure than we actually spend on affordable housing and public housing and housing choice vouchers all combined. And the majority of that funding goes to our upper 5% income earners. At the state level, it's not quite that unequal, but we spend about $1 billion a biennium in Oregon on the state mortgage interest deduction. And again, the vast majority of that goes to people who earn more than $100,000 a year. And until I think the last biennium, that was more collectively in Oregon than we spend on all of our affordable housing sources as well. Now that we have some of the bond dollars getting up closer to $1 billion, it's a little bit more at parity. But I just, sit with that for a sec. We as a state spend more supporting upper income homeowners than we do supporting affordable housing. And that doesn't sit well with me as a just resident of Oregon. I think I want my government to be working for more, I want my government to be working differently than that. I want my government to be worried more about equalizing economic inequality rather than perpetuating economic inequality. I also think, there are some decisions that cities, counties, the state make on behalf of all of us for the public good. And I think of affordable housing as a public good. And I think that's a really appropriate role for the government to play. My communities are better for me when people are housed also, not just for the people who live in that affordable housing. It's better for, I don't have kids either, but it's better for my nieces and nephews to grow up in a state where people are housed. And so that, to me, that's also personal and something I hope that my government is working on. And I would also go one step further and say, I hope we can ask the voters to vote for those things too. I hope we can ask voters to pass local bonds and levies to support affordable housing. Every time I vote for a park bond or a school bond or a police bond, I'm happy to do that, but I also wonder why I'm not being asked to vote for an affordable housing bond, because I would also be voting yes on that. And for my government to be committing me to the expenditure of that money to contribute to the public good of my community. So I want to say yes to all of those expenditure choices at every level, whether my city council is making it on my behalf, whether my county commissioner is making it on my behalf, or whether I'm being asked to make it directly. And I would happily vote against my own mortgage interest deduction, just for the record.
That is a huge eye-opener. I have never thought of it that way. Thank you for saying that. That's huge. Yeah. I can't wait to take that home and have that conversation at the dinner table with all my children.
It's, the mortgage interest deduction is a really interesting question too, because a lot of low-income homeowners don't even get it anymore. The standard deduction is high enough that if you are a lower income homeowner, if you've owned your home for a lot of years, if you're a senior on a fixed income, you probably don't get anything from the mortgage interest deduction. Middle-class folks get, maybe $100 a year, $119 a year. But upper income people with multi-million-dollar homes and vacation homes get tens of thousands of dollars.
I don't have a vacation home. The county does not pay me that well, so I'm just asterisking that statement. So, but yeah, that's wow. Okay, all right. Any other questions, comments? We've got a question over there from Miss Jean. Can you give it just a second while we get the microphone over there?
I think it's more of a comment, and I just hope that a few more people might agree with me on this today. Free education, and the reason I say free education is because children who are going to kindergarten and first grade who know that they are going to have an opportunity for a higher education are going to better prepare themselves from that. When I was tutoring kids up in a North Portland school, I would ask them, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? What kind of a job are you going to have? Oh, I guess I'll work at the subway down the street. Because they know they haven't got a chance in hell of getting a 4-year education or college education or better. I mean, when people are educated, they're making better decisions. They can get a better job. If you educate people to the point where they can get a middle-class job, you don't have to worry about subsidized housing for that many people. I swear, I believe it would work, and there are countries that have already done that. I think Mexico has free education, something like Denmark. It's not like it's a new concept or undoable, and I think it would make an entire world of difference just from the point of view of that child at 5 or 6 years of age who knows he or she is going to get a bachelor's degree minimum if they want to put in the work. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. Any other questions, comments?
What's the best way to advocate for the disparities or disparities in our communities as a neighborhood association?
That's a big question. Could you say a little bit more about what you're trying to get to when you talk about disparities, just to help us focus in?
With the cost of living increases, we have more families really struggling, literally one paycheck away from being homeless. What's the best way to advocate for them at city, state, federal?
Sorry, just a couple thoughts off the cuff, and again, big question and an excellent one, and one I care about deeply. And it's why at Dev Northwest we oftentimes don't frame ourselves as an affordable housing agency. We frame ourselves as an economic equity or economic justice agency, because housing is a building block to economic security, a huge one, but one. I think supporting affordable housing policies and funding at all levels is a big piece of that. But there are also parallel anti-poverty policies. And this also comes back to like policy choices we've made for 40 years as a country, as a state, as communities. One of the very most effective, well, two of the very most effective ones that are proven to make an immediate financial impact on raising people above the poverty line. One is the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit both. That, like, I don't know, a fifth of Oregonians who are eligible for them don't claim and leave that money on the table. So, like, advocating for expanding the state version of that, expanding for tax assistance to help people get that, like all of that at the state level, I think are important advocacy points. And then at the federal level, Congress just let the child tax credits that were happening during COVID expire, to my complete bafflement, with relatively little public outcry in Oregon or around the country. And I think that, like, some of the stats around that program showed that it was like the single most effective thing we've done in like 30 years to raise children out of poverty and to raise families out of poverty. So any sort of collective effort and advocacy and pressure we could start to rebuild around implementing that again. I mean, that's a single policy choice that raised like 30 million children out of poverty or something crazy. So I think, and in my mind, it is really critical that we talk about these anti-poverty measures at the same time that we're talking about affordable housing measures, for sure.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for knowing your neighbors well enough to know that they're suffering and to what degree. And I think there's a lot of power in our communities. And yes, we have to advocate at the state and federal level, and we need 10 more Emilys out there doing that. We also are going to have to rely on our neighbors. And, that's the strongest safety net that we have for the short term, right? For the crisis next winter when it gets too cold, or, for the next heat dome. I would suggest educating yourselves as a neighborhood association on the resources that are available, in walking distance on the transit lines in your community, in order to help share that information. And when you know what's available and what isn't available, it gives you, I was sort of speaking to, have those personal stories. Those personal stories, just, I can't even tell you. If you show up to city council and say, hey, you guys have this great program that helps with energy assistance, but these 5 families in my neighborhood, it's only offered Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and they can't get there because they've got to pick their kid up from school. Is there something like that kind of local information that you have about your neighbors, using that information, educating yourself on what is available, and then translating that knowledge into something that can really help them. That's so powerful, and it makes such a difference. The Earned Income Housing Tax, or the Earned Income Tax Credit, helping those families make sure they know that they're eligible for it. I find taxes completely baffling myself, and I do tax credits for a living. So thank you for asking that question and for being aware.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot to add, just the fact that you're using your voice to amplify their voices is really powerful. There are a lot of personal and structural reasons why people don't participate in the process in a way to advocate for themselves, both because of the intimidating nature of it and because of a lot of structural reasons, like, the hours at which public meetings are held or things like that. And so having those kinds of conversations with the people who need it, and then being able to bring their voice to the table from using whatever position of privilege you have is I think a really powerful thing to do. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for the question, and we're going to wrap it up. Please thank me. Thank me. No. Emily, Tracy, and Sam, for your time. We thank you so much, and your expertise in this area. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. All right, and thank me too, right? No, I'm joking.